She gave away her last meal like it meant nothing, but someone noticed like it meant everything. The diner was small, the kind of place most people passed without remembering, tucked between a laundromat and a flickering convenience store sign. The air carried the steady scent of fried oil and soy sauce, warm and familiar, but never quite comforting. Emily Carter stood behind the counter, her movements efficient, practiced, measured down to the second. She had been on her feet for nearly 10 hours, her back tight, her hands sore, but none of it showed in the way she worked. Orders came in. Plates went out. The rhythm never changed. It was near closing when the boy walked in. He couldn't have been older than 8. His clothes were too thin for the evening chill, his shoes worn down at the edges, his eyes scanning the room not with curiosity, but calculation. Emily noticed him. She always did. The unnoticed ones were the easiest to recognize when you had once been one yourself. He hesitated near the door, then stepped closer to the counter, stopping short, as if unsure how far he was allowed to go. "Do you have anything cheap?" he asked, his voice quiet but steady. Emily glanced at the register. The total from her last order blinked back at her. She knew how much was left in the drawer. She also knew how much she had in her pocket. Neither number was generous. Behind her, the cook was already wiping down the grill, ready to close. The night was over. Almost. She looked back at the boy. His hands were empty. His eyes didn't beg. They waited. Emily turned without answering. She moved to the back counter where one last portion of fried rice sat in a takeout container, untouched, meant for her after her shift. She picked it up, feeling the warmth still lingering through the thin cardboard. For a second, she paused. Not long enough to reconsider. Just long enough to acknowledge the choice. Then she walked back and placed it on the counter in front of him. "This one is already paid for," she said. The boy blinked, confusion crossing his face before it settled into something softer. "Are you sure?" he asked. Emily nodded once. "I am sure." He reached for it, as if afraid it might disappear if he moved too fast. "Thank you," he said, quieter this time. Emily gave a small smile, the kind that didn't ask for anything in return. "Eat while it's warm," she replied. The boy didn't leave. Instead, he sat at the edge of the counter, opening the container, the steam rising in thin, curling lines. He took his first bite quickly, then slowed, savoring it as if each bite mattered more than the last. Emily watched him before turning back to her work, finishing the last few tasks of the night. Most people in the diner barely noticed. A couple glanced over, then returned to their conversations. It was a small thing, easy to miss, but not everyone missed it. In the far corner, a man sat alone, his untouched cup of coffee cooling in front of him. He had been there long enough to see the entire exchange. Daniel Whitmore didn't move. He didn't interrupt. He watched. Not the act itself, but the way it was done. No hesitation. No announcement. No expectation. His gaze shifted briefly to the container, then back to Emily as she wiped down the counter with quiet focus, already moving on as if nothing had happened. That was what held his attention, not the kindness, the normalcy of it, as if giving away her last meal was not a sacrifice, but a habit. Daniel leaned back in his seat, his expression unreadable, his eyes still fixed on her. Around him, the diner continued its slow descent into closing time. Chairs stacked, lights dimmed, conversations faded. But something in the room had changed, subtle and unspoken, like a line drawn between what people saw and what they chose to overlook. Emily finished her shift without looking in his direction. She didn't know she had been seen. She didn't expect to be. For her, it was already over. Just another night. Just another small decision that cost her a little more than she could afford. But for Daniel, it was not over. It had begun. The boy finished every grain of rice. Emily noticed it without looking directly, the way she noticed everything that mattered without making it obvious. When he closed the container, he held it, as if deciding whether to throw it away or keep it. Then he stood, walked it to the trash, and came back to the counter. "Thank you again," he said. His voice was steadier now, warmer. Emily nodded once. "You are welcome." That was all. No questions. No follow-up. The boy hesitated like he wanted to say more, then turned and left, the bell above the door chiming as it closed behind him. The diner felt quieter after that. Not because the noise had stopped, but because something had shifted beneath it. Emily wiped down the same spot on the counter twice before moving on, her motions a fraction slower than before. It was the only sign that the moment had meant anything to her at all. In the corner, Daniel remained still. His coffee had gone cold, but he didn't touch it. He watched the door long after the boy disappeared, then shifted his attention back to Emily. He didn't see gratitude in her expression. He didn't see pride. What he saw was something else. Routine. As if what had happened belonged to a pattern, not a single choice. That was what held his focus. Patterns were predictable. Patterns could be understood. And this one didn't match anything he expected. He reached for his wallet, placing a few bills on the table, more than enough to cover what he had ordered. Then he stood. The movement was quiet, controlled, barely noticeable to anyone else in the room. He walked toward the counter, stopping enough distance away to be acknowledged without interrupting her rhythm. Emily looked up, her expression neutral, her attention present but not inviting. "We are closing," she said, not unkindly, factual. Daniel nodded once. "I know," he replied. His voice was calm, measured, the kind that didn't need to raise itself to be heard. For a second, neither of them spoke. The silence didn't feel awkward. It felt intentional. Daniel glanced briefly at the spot where the container had been, then back at her. "You gave away your dinner," he said. It was not a question. Emily's hand paused for a fraction of a second before continuing its motion across the counter. "It was already paid for," she answered. The same words, the same tone. Daniel studied her, the consistency confirming more than any explanation could. "And you won't replace it," he continued. Emily met his gaze this time, her eyes steady, unreadable. "I will be fine," she said. There was no defense in her voice. No attempt toify. Just a simple truth she had accepted long ago. Daniel leaned against the counter, not crossing into her space, but not keeping distance either. "You say that like it doesn't matter," he said. Emily tilted her head a fraction, considering him for the first time instead of responding. "It matters," she replied. "Just not in the way you think." The answer lingered between them. Daniel didn't push further. He didn't need to. He had learned enough to understand that asking the wrong question would close the door he hadn't yet opened. Instead, he shifted, his attention moving beyond the immediate moment. "Do you work here every night?" he asked. Emily hesitated, not because she didn't want to answer, but because she was deciding whether the question deserved one. "Most nights," she said finally. Daniel nodded once, committing it to memory without making it obvious. "Then I'll come back," he said. The statement was quiet, casual, but it carried intent beneath it. Emily didn't react the way most people would. She didn't ask why. She didn't assume anything. She wiped the last section of the counter and set the cloth aside. "We open at 10, she said. It was not an invitation. It was information. Daniel accepted it as both. He straightened, reaching into his pocket and placing something on the counter. Not money. A simple receipt, folded once. "For the coffee," he said. Emily glanced at it briefly, then back at him. "You already paid," she replied. Daniel gave a small nod. "Then consider it a reason to come back," he said. The words were subtle, but deliberate. Emily didn't pick it up. Not yet. She held his gaze longer than necessary, then gave a slight nod. Not agreement. Not refusal. Just acknowledgement. Daniel turned and walked toward the door, his pace unhurried, his posture unchanged. The bell chimed again as he stepped out into the night. Emily stood there, the quiet settling fully now that the last customer had left. Then she reached for the folded receipt, opening it. Inside, there was nothing written, just a name printed at the top. She looked at it, her expression still calm, but something in her eyes shifted. Not curiosity, not yet, just awareness. And for the first time that night, she didn't move right away. The name stayed with her longer than she expected. Emily locked the diner that night with the same routine she followed every evening, turning the sign to closed, checking the register twice, wiping down surfaces that were already clean. Nothing in her movements suggested distraction, but her mind didn't move in the same steady rhythm. It paused. It returned. It circled back to a single detail she hadn't asked for. Daniel Whitmore. She didn't recognize it at first. It was a name on a receipt. Nothing more. That was how it should have remained. By the time she stepped outside, the street was nearly empty, the neon light above the diner flickering as if it was tired too. She adjusted her jacket, pulling it closer against the cool air, and began the walk home. It was under a mile. She had measured it more times than she could count. The sidewalk cracked in familiar places. The same street lamp buzzed halfway down the block. The same quiet settled around her with every step. She preferred it that way. Predictable. Manageable. But tonight, something followed her. Not a presence. Not a sound. Just a thought that refused to stay where she left it. When she reached her building, she climbed the stairs, not from exhaustion, but from habit. Each step marked the transition from one world to another. Work ended. Everything else began. She unlocked the door, easing it open enough to slip inside without making noise. The apartment was dim, lit only by a small lamp in the corner. Her son was asleep on the couch, a blanket half pulled over him, one arm hanging loosely off the side. Emily paused at the doorway, watching him. This was the part of her life that didn't shift. This was the part that held everything else in place. She walked over and adjusted the blanket, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. He stirred, then settled again. "I am home," she whispered, even though he couldn't hear her. The words were more for her than for him. She moved through the apartment, setting her keys down, slipping off her shoes, letting the weight of the day settle into something softer. The kitchen light flicked on with a low hum. She opened the cabinet, then paused. There was nothing inside that resembled a full meal. A few essentials. Enough to get through the morning. Enough to make it work. She closed the door without taking anything out. Hunger was not unfamiliar. It was something she knew how to ignore. She leaned against the counter, her eyes drifting to the small table where she usually sorted bills and receipts. Without thinking, she reached into her pocket and pulled out the folded paper. She opened it again, smoothing it flat against the surface. Daniel Whitmore. The name looked different now. Not because it had changed, but because she had. Something about the way he had spoken. The way he hadn't tried to convince her. The way he had noticed what others ignored. It didn't fit into the patterns she understood. That was what unsettled her. Emily sat down, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of the paper. She didn't search the name. She didn't reach for her phone. She didn't need confirmation. Not yet. Instead, she looked at it as if it were a question she hadn't decided to answer. Across the room, her son shifted again, pulling the blanket closer to his chest. The small movement grounded her instantly. That was the answer that mattered. Everything else came after. She folded the paper once more and placed it on the table, not hidden, not displayed, present. Then she stood and turned off the light, letting the room fall into quiet again. Tomorrow would come the same way it always did. Work, routine, responsibility. But something had entered the space between those things. Not loud, not demanding, just enough to be noticed. And for the first time in a long while, Emily didn't push it away. Morning didn't wait for her to decide. It arrived the same way it always did, and without permission, pulling her back into motion before her thoughts had fully settled. Emily woke before the alarm, her eyes opening to the soft gray light filtering through the curtains. For a second, she stayed still, listening. Her son's breathing from the other room. The faint hum of the refrigerator. The steady silence of a life that left little room for hesitation. She pushed herself up and moved into the kitchen, her steps light, automatic. Coffee first, then breakfast. The rhythm returned easily, as if nothing had shifted the night before. But something had. It lingered at the edge of her awareness, quiet but persistent, like a question waiting for the right moment to be asked. Her son padded into the kitchen a few minutes later, still half asleep, his hair uneven, his eyes soft. "You are up early," he murmured. Emily smiled, placing a plate in front of him. "So are you," she replied. He climbed into his chair without another word, reaching for the fork, focused only on what was in front of him. It was simple. It was enough. Emily watched him, letting that ground her before she turned back to the counter. After breakfast, she walked him to school, his small hand wrapped around hers, his steps uneven but determined. He talked about something she had missed the beginning of, a story about a classmate or a game, and she listened, nodding at the right moments, her attention fully his. When they reached the gate, he let go, running ahead to join the others. Emily stayed longer, watching until he disappeared into the building. Then she turned and walked away. The diner looked the same in daylight, less forgiving. The flickering sign was off now, replaced by a dull, steady presence that blended into the street. Inside, the air still carried the same scent, though it felt sharper in the morning. Emily tied her apron, her hands moving with practiced ease, her mind already settling into the day. Orders came in quickly. Coffee refills. Plates stacked and cleared. The rhythm didn't leave space for distraction, but it didn't erase it either. Around mid-morning, The door opened again. The bell chimed once, soft but distinct. Emily didn't look up right away. She finished pouring a cup, set it down, then turned. He was there. Daniel Whitmore stood near the entrance, his presence unchanged from the night before, composed, controlled, but now fully out of place in the daylight. His suit was the same, his posture the same, but the room was different, and so was the context. Emily held his gaze, her expression neutral, then returned to her work. She didn't acknowledge him beyond that. She didn't need to. He walked to the counter, taking the same seat as before. "Coffee," he said. His voice was calm, familiar now. Emily poured it without asking anything else, placing it in front of him with steady hands. "We open at 10, she said, repeating the same words from the night before, though the door had clearly been unlocked for hours. Daniel allowed a small pause before responding. "I know," he said. "I waited." Emily didn't react to that. She picked up a cloth and continued wiping the counter, her movements precise, controlled. "Why are you here?" she asked after a moment. The question was direct. No hesitation. Daniel met her gaze, not looking away this time. "Because I don't think what I saw last night was accidental," he said. Emily stopped for a fraction of a second, then resumed her motion. "It was dinner," she replied. "Nothing more." Daniel shook his head. "It was a choice," he said. "And choices repeat." Emily set the cloth down, finally turning to face him fully. There was no irritation in her expression. No curiosity either. Just clarity. "You are trying to make it something bigger," she said. Daniel leaned forward enough to close the distance between observation and conversation. "I am trying to understand why it's not," he replied. The words settled between them, not heavy, but undeniable. Emily held his gaze longer, measuring something she hadn't expected to measure this morning. Then she exhaled. "People do what they can," she said. "That is all." Daniel didn't argue. He didn't push. He watched her, the same way he had the night before, but now with something more defined behind it. Not curiosity, recognition. And for the first time since he walked in, Emily didn't turn away. The morning moved forward, but something had shifted beneath its surface. Emily felt it not in the way the diner looked or sounded, but in the way the moments stretched a little longer than usual. Daniel didn't rush. He didn't check his phone. He didn't fill the silence with unnecessary words. He sat there, watching, not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that refused to disappear. Emily returned to her routine, moving between tables, refilling cups, taking orders, her focus steady and deliberate. But she was aware of him, not as a distraction, as a presence that remained constant while everything else changed around it. Near noon, the diner grew busier. The quiet morning gave way to overlapping voices, the clatter of dishes, the steady rhythm of a place that survived on repetition. Emily moved faster now, her steps precise, her attention divided but controlled. That was when the second moment came. A woman entered, her posture tense, her eyes scanning the room with urgency. She approached the counter, speaking quickly, her words carrying a slight accent that made them harder to follow. Emily listened without interrupting, her expression calm, focused. The woman was trying to explain something about a meeting, a location, a time she couldn't quite translate correctly. The words tangled as she spoke, frustration building with each attempt. Most people in the diner looked away. It was easier that way. Emily did not. She leaned forward, her voice soft but clear as she responded, shifting into the woman's language. The change was immediate. The woman's expression softened, relief replacing confusion. They spoke for a minute, maybe two. It was not long, but it was enough. Emily clarified the directions, repeated the key details, then wrote them down on a small piece of paper, handing it over with a small nod. The woman smiled, gratitude visible in her eyes now, and thanked her before leaving quickly. The moment passed, as the one the night before. No applause, no acknowledgement, just another interaction absorbed into the flow of the day. Emily returned to her work without pause, picking up a tray, clearing a table, continuing as if nothing unusual had happened. But Daniel had seen it. Not the act, but the ease of it. The fluency. The confidence that didn't ask to be noticed. He leaned back, his gaze narrowing with a different kind of focus now. It was no longer about kindness alone. It was about capability. When Emily returned to the counter, he spoke again. "How many languages do you speak?" he asked. His tone was calm, But there was something more deliberate behind the question this time. Emily wiped her hands on her apron before answering, not rushing, not avoiding. Enough to help when it's needed, she said. Daniel watched her, then nodded once. That isn't a small thing, he replied. Emily met his gaze briefly, then looked away, reaching for a stack of clean cups. It is a useful thing, she corrected. There is a difference. Daniel didn't argue. He understood the distinction she was making. Value versus recognition. Function versus identity. He leaned forward, resting his hand on the counter, his posture still controlled but no longer distant. You don't seem interested in being recognized, he said. Emily placed the cups down, aligning them without looking at him. Recognition doesn't change what needs to be done, she answered. It changes how people talk about it. The words settled between them, quiet but firm. Daniel studied her again, not searching for weakness, but for consistency. It was there. In every answer. In every action. Nothing contradicted itself. That was what made it rare. Around them, the diner continued, unaware of the shift taking place at the counter. Emily finally looked back at him, her expression steady, her voice calm. You are still here, she said. It was not a question. Daniel allowed a small pause before responding. Yes, he said. I am. Emily held his gaze longer, then gave a slight nod. Not agreement. Not invitation. Just acknowledgement that whatever this was, it hadn't ended yet. The question didn't come right away. Daniel let the moment stretch, as if he understood that timing mattered more than intention. Emily returned to her work, but the space between them no longer felt neutral. It felt measured. Observed from both sides now. A few customers left. New ones came in. The rhythm held, but the center of it had shifted to the counter where neither of them seemed in a hurry to leave. When the rush softened again, Daniel spoke. What do you want? He asked. The question was simple. Direct. It didn't carry assumptions. Emily didn't answer. She picked up a glass, dried it with a clean cloth, her eyes focused on the surface as if clarity could be found there first. That depends, she said. On what I can afford to want. Daniel studied her, the answer aligning with everything he had seen so far. Practical. Grounded. Controlled by reality rather than imagination. If that were not a factor, he said, what would you choose? Emily paused, not because she didn't know, but because she rarely allowed herself to consider it. The silence that followed was not empty. It was deliberate. She set the glass down, her hands resting lightly on the counter. Something stable, she said. Something that doesn't disappear when one thing goes wrong. Daniel nodded once, absorbing the answer without interrupting. And beyond that, he asked. Emily met his gaze again, this time holding it longer. There was no hesitation now, a quiet honesty she didn't offer often. To be seen for what I can do, she said. Not for what I need. The words landed cleanly between them. No embellishment. No defense. Just truth. Daniel leaned back, his expression shifting in a way that was imperceptible, but real. That was the line. Not need. Not rescue. Recognition. He understood it fully now. You already are, he said. Emily gave a small shake of her head. Not in a way that changes anything, she replied. Daniel didn't argue. He didn't need to convince her with words. Instead, he reached into his pocket and placed something on the counter again. This time, it was not a receipt. It was a card. Clean. Minimal. Intentional. Emily looked at it, but didn't pick it up. I don't give money to people I don't understand, Daniel said. And I don't offer opportunities to people I don't trust. Emily's eyes moved from the card back to him. There was no surprise in her expression. Only caution. You don't know me, she said. Daniel held her gaze steadily. I know enough to ask the right questions, he replied. Emily considered that, not dismissing it, not accepting it either, just weighing it against everything else she had learned to rely on. And what are you asking, she said. Daniel's voice remained calm, but there was no hesitation now. I am asking if you're willing to step into something that matches what you're capable of, he said. Emily let the words settle. They were not dramatic. They were not persuasive. That was what made them harder to ignore. She looked down at the card again, her fingers resting near it, but not touching. And if I say no? She asked. Daniel didn't look away. Then nothing changes, he said. For me or for you? Emily exhaled, the weight of the decision forming not in what was being offered, but in what it might require. She had built her life on certainty, on limits she understood. This was something else. Not uncertain, just unfamiliar. She finally picked up the card, holding it lightly between her fingers. The name was the same. The difference was everything around it. She didn't ask what company. She didn't ask what role. Not yet. Instead, she looked at him one more time, her expression steady, grounded in something deeper than fear or hope. I am not someone you can fix, she said. The words were clear. Not defensive, just defined. Daniel gave a small nod, the faintest trace of understanding in his expression. I am not here to fix you, he replied. I am here because you're already complete. The answer didn't change her posture. It didn't soften her expression, but something in her eyes shifted. Not trust, not yet, but recognition of something she hadn't heard before. And for the first time since he walked in that morning, Emily didn't look away first. Emily didn't answer right away. She turned the card between her fingers once, then set it down on the counter as if placing it there would keep the decision contained. Around them, the diner continued its steady rhythm, but the space between them had narrowed into something precise. Defined. She picked up the cloth again, wiping a surface that no longer needed it, giving herself a moment that was not about avoidance, but about control. You said nothing changes, she began, her voice calm, even. But that isn't true. Daniel watched her without interrupting. If I say yes, she continued, everything changes. My time, my schedule, my son's routine, the things I can and can't promise him. She met his gaze, not challenging, clear. That isn't a small decision. Daniel nodded once. I know, he said. Emily held his eyes longer, measuring whether that answer was enough. It was not dismissal. It was not persuasion. It was acknowledgement. That mattered, but it didn't resolve anything. She stepped back, creating enough distance to think without being pulled into his presence. What are you offering? She asked. The question was direct now. Necessary. Daniel didn't reach for the card. He didn't list titles or numbers. Instead, he chose his words. I run an international firm, he said. We work across multiple markets, different countries, different languages. Communication matters more than anything else. Emily listened, her expression unchanged. You saw that, she said. It was not a question. Daniel gave a small nod. I saw more than that, he replied. I saw how you listen before you respond, how you adjust without making it obvious, how you don't turn it into something about yourself. Emily looked down for a brief moment, then back at him. That is part of the job, she said. Daniel shook his head. No, he said. That is part of who you are. The distinction landed differently this time. Not as praise, as recognition. Emily exhaled, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the counter. And you think that fits in your world? She said. Daniel didn't hesitate. I know it does, he answered. The certainty in his voice didn't feel forced. It felt earned. That made it harder to dismiss. Emily glanced toward the door, as if measuring the distance between where she stood and everything outside of it. Then she looked back at him. And what happens when it does not? She asked. Daniel held her gaze. Then we adjust, he said. But I don't build things on uncertainty. I build them on people who already understand what matters. Emily was quiet. The words didn't overwhelm her. They settled. They asked to be considered, not accepted. You are asking me to step into something I've never been part of, she said. Daniel nodded. Yes, he replied. But not as someone new. As someone who already belongs there. Emily let out a small breath, a quiet laugh, without sound. Not because it was amusing, because it was unfamiliar. You make it sound simple, she said. Daniel leaned back, his expression softening enough to reveal something more human beneath the control. It isn't simple, he said. But it's clear. Emily looked at the card again. This time, her fingers rested on it longer. Not picking it up, not pushing it away, just holding the space between decision and action. I can't answer you right now, she said. Daniel didn't react with disappointment. He nodded. I didn't expect you to, he replied. Emily met his gaze again, her expression steady, grounded. I need to know what this means for my son, she added. Daniel's response came without pause. Then that's where we start, he said. The answer shifted something. Not the decision, the direction of it. Emily gave a small nod, more to herself than to him. Then she picked up the card again, this time not as a question, but as something she might carry forward. I will think about it, she said. Daniel stood, his movements controlled, unhurried. That is all I'm asking, he replied. He paused, then added, I will be here tomorrow. Emily didn't respond. She watched him as he turned and walked toward the door, the same steady presence moving through a space that no longer felt separate from her own. The bell chimed as he left. The diner returned to its rhythm. But Emily didn't move right away. She stood there, the card still in her hand, aware that something had shifted again. Not because of what was offered, but because, for the first time, she was considering a life that didn't begin and end within the same familiar walls. That night felt different before she even reached the door. Emily could sense it in the way her steps slowed as she approached the apartment, in the way her hand lingered on the doorknob longer than usual. It was not hesitation. It was awareness. Something inside her had shifted, and she hadn't yet decided what to do with it. She stepped inside, the familiar dim light greeting her, the same small space that had always been enough. Her son was awake this time, sitting at the table with a piece of paper and a pencil, drawing with the kind of focus only children could hold. He looked up when he heard her. "You are late," he said, not accusing, noticing. Emily smiled, setting her bag down. "Just a little," she replied. She walked over and kissed the top of his head, her hand resting there longer than necessary. "What are you working on?" she asked. He turned the paper toward her proudly. It was simple. A house. 2 figures standing beside it. One taller, one smaller. The lines were uneven, but the intention was clear. Emily felt something tighten in her chest. Not painful, real. "It looks strong," she said. He nodded. "It has to be," he answered. "So it doesn't fall." Emily sat down across from him, her eyes still on the drawing. "And what keeps it standing?" she asked. He thought, then tapped the page. "Both of them," he said. The answer stayed with her longer than he realized. She nodded once, then reached into her pocket and placed the card on the table between them. He looked at it with curiosity, his head tilting. "What is that?" he asked. Emily followed his gaze, seeing it now not as an object, but as a decision waiting to be made. "Something someone gave me," she said. He picked it up, turning it over in his small hands. "Is it important?" he asked. Emily didn't answer right away. She watched him instead, the way he handled it without fear, without expectation, curiosity. "It might be," she said finally. He looked back at her, his expression open, uncomplicated. "Then you shouldn't lose it," he said. Emily let out a small breath, a quiet laugh. "No," she agreed. "I should not." He placed it back on the table, then returned to his drawing, as if the moment had already passed for him. For her, it had begun. Later, after he fell asleep, Emily sat alone at the same table. The apartment was quiet again, but the silence felt different now. Not empty, full of something she hadn't allowed herself to consider before. She picked up the card, turning it between her fingers, the same motion she had made earlier in the day. But this time, it was not about holding distance. It was about understanding what that distance meant. She thought about the diner, the routine, the certainty, the way every day looked the same, predictable in a way that made it manageable, safe. She also thought about the moments that had broken that pattern. The boy, the woman, the way Daniel had seen both without being told where to look. That was what unsettled her most. Not the offer, the recognition behind it. Emily leaned back in her chair, her eyes drifting toward the doorway where her son slept. His world was simple, clear. He believed in things because they made sense to him. Strength meant something that didn't fall. Stability meant something that stayed. She had built her life around that idea, around making sure nothing collapsed, around making sure he never had to question whether things would hold. But now there was something else. Not a threat to that stability, a possibility that might reshape it. She stood, walking to the small window, looking out at the dim street below. The same street she walked every night. The same path she knew by memory. It had never felt small to her before. It had felt enough. She returned to the table, placing the card down, not as something uncertain, but as something she was beginning to accept as real. Then she reached for her phone. She didn't search his name. She didn't look for proof. She held the phone in her hand, considering what it would mean to step beyond what she already understood. After a second, she set it back down. Not because she had decided against it, because she had decided to wait until she could choose without fear. The next day was not far away, and for the first time, Emily knew that when it arrived, she wouldn't meet it the same way she always had. The next morning arrived with a clarity Emily hadn't felt in a long time. It was not certainty. It was not confidence. It was something quieter, a decision that hadn't yet been spoken, but had already taken shape beneath everything else. She moved through the morning as she always did, preparing breakfast, walking her son to school, listening to his stories with the same steady attention. Nothing in her routine changed, but something in her posture did. It was subtle, a difference in how she held herself, as if she was no longer moving through the day, but moving towards something within it. When she reached the diner, she didn't pause outside the door. She didn't measure the moment. She stepped inside, tied her apron, and began her shift with the same quiet precision. The hours passed in their usual rhythm, orders coming and going, voices rising and fading, the steady movement of a place that never stopped long enough to notice itself. But she noticed the time. Not anxiously, not impatiently, just aware. When the door finally opened again, the sound of the bell didn't surprise her. Daniel walked in with the same composed presence, his pace unhurried, his expression unchanged. But this time, the space between them felt different from the start. It was no longer a question. It was an answer waiting to be spoken. He took his seat at the counter, his gaze meeting hers. "Good morning," he said. Emily nodded once. "Good morning," she replied. Her voice was steady, grounded. She poured his coffee without asking, placing it in front of him with the same practiced motion. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was not empty. It was intentional. Then Emily reached into her pocket and placed the card on the counter between them. Not cautiously, simply directly. "I thought about it," she said. Daniel didn't touch the card. He watched her instead, giving the moment the space it required. And he prompted. Emily met his gaze, her expression calm, but fully present now. "I am not saying yes to you," she said. The words were clear, measured. Daniel didn't react. He waited. "I am saying yes to the work," she continued. "To the part of me that hasn't been used yet. To something that might give my son more than I can give him here." She paused, long enough to make sure the meaning held. "If that's what you're offering." Daniel nodded once, the faintest shift in his expression reflecting something deeper than approval. "Respect. That is what I'm offering," he said. Emily let out a small breath, not of relief, but of alignment. The decision had been made. Now it needed to be defined. "Then I've conditions," she added. Daniel leaned forward, his attention sharpening, not resistant, but engaged. "I expected that," he replied. Emily rested her hand lightly on the counter, her posture steady, her voice even. "My son comes first," she said. "His schedule doesn't change unless I decide it should. I don't disappear into something that takes me away from him without control." Daniel listened without interruption, his gaze fixed on her, not analyzing, but understanding. "That isn't negotiable," she finished. Daniel nodded. "It doesn't need to be," he said. Emily studied him, measuring the answer, not the words. Then she continued. "I don't want to be placed somewhere I don't understand," she said. "If I step into your world, I need to know what I'm doing, why I'm doing it, and how it matters." Daniel's response came as steadily. "Then you will," he said. "Clarity is part of the work." Emily held his gaze longer, then gave a small nod. That was enough. Not because everything had been answered, but because the foundation had been set. Daniel reached for the card then, not to take it back, but to slide it closer to her. "We start with a meeting," he said. "No commitment beyond that. You see the work. You decide if it fits." Emily looked down at the card, then back at him. "When?" she asked. "Tomorrow," he replied. Emily considered it for a brief moment, then nodded once. "Tomorrow," she agreed. The words settled between them, simple but definitive. Daniel stood, his movements calm, controlled, but no longer distant. "I will have someone send the details," he said. Emily nodded again, her expression steady, but something in her eyes had changed. Not uncertainty, not hesitation, direction. As he turned to leave, the bell chimed behind him, the same sound it had made every time he walked in or out. But this time, it marked something different. Not an ending, a beginning. Emily remained at the counter, her hand resting lightly on the surface, the card still in front of her. Around her, the diner continued as it always had. Orders came in. Plates went out. Voices rose and fell. Nothing in the world had shifted. But for her, everything had. She picked up the card one more time, not as a question, not as a possibility, but as something she had chosen to carry forward. And for the first time in a long while, the life she had built didn't feel like a limit. It felt like a foundation.